There is a feeling you may know well. It arrives at night, usually, when the room is quiet and the day has finally let go of you. It is not exactly sadness. It is not quite fear. It sits somewhere between them, a pressure behind the chest, a soft ache with no clear address. You may have called it loneliness or anxiety, or that restlessness that comes when everything is still and you cannot explain why you feel so far from something you cannot even name. Tonight, we are going to sit with that feeling, not to fix it, not to diagnose it, but to understand where it came from and why it has stayed so long. Because the man who spent his life studying exactly that feeling, that ache for closeness, that ancient alarm that sounds when connection feels threatened, was a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby. And what he found changed everything we know about how human beings love, grieve, fear, and heal. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. You do not have to hold yourself up for this. Bowlby was born in London in 1907, the fourth of 6 children in a prosperous family that ran, as upper-class English families did in that era, on distance. Warmth existed, but it was measured. Children were cared for by nannies. Parents appeared at scheduled intervals. The house was orderly. The feelings in it were not spoken aloud. He was sent to boarding school at age 7. He was 7 years old, separated from his home, from the people whose faces meant safety, and he was expected to adapt, to be brave, to get on with it. He did. Outwardly, he did. But something in him kept asking a question that would take him decades to answer. What does it do to a child to be separated from the people they love? That question became his life's work. And the answers he uncovered reach far beyond childhood. There is a kind of pain that has no name. You have felt it in the middle of a conversation that goes cold, in the moment someone turns away, in the night after a relationship ends, in the strange grief that follows even the minor distances of daily life. Tonight, we will give that pain a name, a history, and a home. Because once you understand where the ache comes from, it loses some of its power to frighten you. And that quieting, that small, true relief is where we are headed. Let the next breath come slowly. Let this night be long enough for what we need to explore. And if your mind wanders in the hours ahead, if it drifts away from these words into its own quiet territory, that is perfectly fine. The parts that matter will find you. The body receives what the mind does not always follow, and by morning, something may feel different in ways you cannot quite name. Bowlby spent over 40 years building a theory he called attachment. Not a theory about weakness or neediness or dependency. A theory about biology, about survival, about the ancient, wired-in wisdom of a creature who cannot survive alone. The ache for closeness is not a flaw in your character. It is one of the oldest truths in human nature, and here is what makes it stranger and more beautiful. The same system that causes the most exquisite pain of separation is also the very foundation on which courage, curiosity, and joy are built. Hold that quietly. We will come back to it, but first, let us go back to the beginning. Let the room be quiet around you. Let the breath come and go without effort. You do not have to do anything with what you hear tonight. You only have to listen, and in the listening, something may settle that has been unsettled for a long time, not to your beginning exactly, though yours matters, and we will reach it. Let us go back to a morning in a London office sometime in the 1940s, when a young psychiatrist looked at a group of troubled adolescent boys and asked a question that nobody in his field had thought to ask before. And the question was simple. What happened to these children when they were very small? Chapter 2. Why Bonds Shape the Mind. In the years after the Second World War, London was full of children who had been moved, evacuated during the bombing, sent to institutions when parents were ill or absent or unable to cope, placed in nurseries that prided themselves on cleanliness and routine and gave very little thought to what a child needed beyond food and hygiene. The children, by most measures, were surviving. They were fed. They were clothed. They were housed. And yet something in many of them was not right. John Bowlby noticed this. He had been working with troubled children for years by then, and he noticed a pattern that the psychiatric establishment of his day was not designed to see. He looked at the histories of his young patients and found again and again a common thread: early separation. Not trauma in the dramatic sense, not violence or disaster, just absence. A mother who was hospitalized for months when the child was 2. A father who disappeared. A move to a new caretaker at a critical moment. A disruption in the one relationship that was supposed to be steady. He decided to look more carefully. He studied 44 young men who had been referred to his clinic for juvenile theft. He traced their histories backward, and he found that a significant number had experienced prolonged separation from their mothers in the first years of life. He published his findings in 1,944 inches, a paper titled The 44 Juvenile Thieves. The medical and psychiatric establishment found it interesting, but the deeper question, why would early separation produce such lasting effects, was not something that the existing frameworks could explain. Feel the weight of your body where it rests right now, just for a moment. There is nothing to figure out. The frameworks of the time said, what matters is what a child is taught and what a child is given. Feed them, teach them right from wrong, provide for their physical needs. The inner life of a child, the emotional world, the quality of early attachment, this was not considered the primary concern of science. It was considered soft, sentimental even. But Bowlby was already thinking differently. He had begun reading across disciplines that his colleagues rarely touched. He read the new science of ethology, the study of animal behavior in natural conditions. He read about Konrad Lorenz and the goslings that had imprinted on the scientist as if he were their mother. He read about Harry Harlow's experiments with young rhesus monkeys, which would eventually show the world something it did not want to see. And what he was building, slowly and carefully, was a new way of understanding human development, not based on drives, not based on learning theory, not based on food and reward, based on bond, based on the primal, biological, essential need of one creature for another, the need to be near, the need to know that if danger came, someone would come. Here is the layer beneath that, the part that changes everything. Bowlby was not describing a weakness in human beings, he was describing a strength. A piece of evolutionary wisdom so old that it predates language, predates civilization, predates nearly everything we think of as human culture. The instinct to attach is the instinct to survive. In the history of our species, the infant who cried and reached and clung and protested separation was the infant who was found, who was held, who lived. The child who did not, did not. The ache for closeness, the alarm that sounds when someone important moves away, the grief that arrives when a bond is broken, these are not signs that something is wrong with you, they are proof that something is profoundly, ancestrally right. And that reframe, that small but essential shift in how we understand our own longing, is the first gift that Bowlby offers us tonight. But there is a quieter layer beneath that, because if the instinct to attach is not a weakness, then the pain of imperfect attachment is not a personal failure either. And if it is not a failure, then perhaps what we have called our anxiety, our fear of being left, our difficulty trusting, our longing that never quite finds its home, perhaps all of this deserves a different kind of attention, not shame, not analysis, not a plan to fix it, something closer to understanding, something closer to care. Let us continue. Chapter 3. The infant who reaches picture a child, months old, lying in a crib. The room is ordinary. There is light coming through a curtain. There are sounds from another part of the house. The child stirs, opens its eyes, looks at the ceiling, and then something shifts. Maybe a hunger. Maybe a sound that frightened. Maybe simply the awareness of aloneness. And the child does something so natural that we forget to marvel at it. It calls, the face crumples, the arms reach, the whole small body orients itself toward an absent presence, not yet with words, with something older than words. This is the beginning of everything Bowlby was trying to understand. The human infant is, at birth, one of the most helpless creatures in the animal kingdom. A foal can walk within hours of being born. A calf can follow its mother across a field within a day. The human newborn cannot lift its own head. This helplessness is not accidental. It is the price of our enormous brains, brains so large that if the skull waited until they were fully formed to pass through the birth canal, No mother would survive the birth. And so we are born incomplete, born dependent, born in a very real sense unfinished. The infant needs warmth, milk, protection from cold and danger and disease. These needs are obvious. They are the ones that older frameworks of child development focused on. But Bowlby saw something else. The infant also needs a specific person, not care in the abstract, not warmth from any warm source. A face, a voice, a smell, a particular rhythm of being held. And this preference, this fierce biological preference for one particular person, is not learned through feeding or reward. It appears to be built in, wired into the deepest layers of the nervous system. Let your jaw soften now. Let the next breath move a little more slowly. Bowlby was influenced by the work of ethologists studying attachment behaviors in other animals. The goslings that waddled after Konrad Lorenz, as if he were their mother, were showing something the scientists called imprinting, a biologically timed window in which the young creature bonds to whoever is present and attentive. And the behavior that resulted was not just affection, it was a whole system. A system of orientation, of following, of alarm at separation, of comfort at reunion. A system whose purpose was proximity. Stay close to the one who is safe. Signal when that closeness is lost. Be soothed when it is restored. This is what Bowlby called the attachment behavioral system. And in the human infant, it is exquisitely sensitive. Because the human infant's vulnerability is so extreme and the period of dependence is so long that the system must work with great precision, it does. In the first weeks of life, an infant begins to discriminate between faces. By 3 months, a baby will smile more readily at its primary caregiver than at a stranger. By 6 or 7 months, something remarkable happens. The baby develops what Bowlby called attachment proper, a clear, specific, intense bond to one or a few particular people. And alongside that bond, appearing at almost exactly the same time, comes something new: fear. Fear of strangers, fear of separation. The cry that arises when the caregiver leaves the room, the reaching arms. The protest. These two things, attachment and the fear of losing it, are born together. And this is not coincidental. You cannot have one without the other. Love, in its earliest and most fundamental form, is also an alarm system. Because once someone matters, their absence matters. And here is the small detail that changes everything. This is not something that happens to us. This is something that we are. The ache for closeness is not imposed on the human heart by culture or circumstance. It is native to the human nervous system. It is as much a part of our biology as breathing, which means that if you have ever felt that ache, the one that arrives when someone pulls away, the one that wakes you at 2 a.m, the one you cannot always explain, you are not broken. You are human, completely, fully, inescapably human. And that is worth sitting with for a moment before we go further. Let your body be heavy right now. Let whatever is beneath you take the full weight. You do not need to carry yourself through this. Just listen. Chapter 4. Attachment before language. Before a child can speak, they know. Not in the way we use the word know when we mean conscious understanding. Not with words or reasoning or any of the tools we adults rely on. They know in the body, in the way the breath changes when the familiar face appears, in the way the muscles soften when familiar arms hold them, in the way the whole small system, heart rate, cortisol, temperature, shifts when the person who means safety is in the room. This is not metaphor, it is physiology. One of the things Bowlby helped us understand is that the brain, in its earliest years, is being built by experience. Every interaction with a caregiver is a lesson that the nervous system receives and records. Not with memory, in the way you remember your first day of school, but with something deeper, a pattern, a template, a felt sense of how the world works. Safe or not safe, responsive or not responsive, close or far. And here is what makes this so significant. These lessons arrive before the part of the brain that uses language is developed. They are laid down in the layers beneath conscious thought, in the structures that regulate emotion, that govern the body's response to threat, that determine how we relate to others for the rest of our lives. Let your breathing settle. Feel the surface beneath you, solid and still. There is nothing required of you right now. Mary Ainsworth, a developmental psychologist who worked closely with Bowlby, made this visible in a way that nobody had managed before. In the 1960s and 70s, she designed a research procedure called the strange situation. It was elegant in its simplicity. A mother and infant arrived in a comfortable room. They played for a few minutes. Then a stranger entered. Then the mother left briefly. Then the mother returned. And Ainsworth watched what happened. What she found was that infants responded to the mother's departure and return in very different ways, and these differences were not random. Some infants, about 60% in her studies, were distressed when their mother left, but calmed quickly when she returned. They sought contact, received comfort, and went back to exploring. Ainsworth called these children securely attached. Other infants were intensely distressed when their mother left, but when she returned, they could not be comforted. They sought contact and pushed it away at the same time. They seemed both to need the mother and to not quite trust her. Ainsworth called this anxious ambivalent attachment. And a third group, smaller, quieter, seemed not to notice much when the mother left. When she returned, they did not rush to her. They turned away or stayed absorbed in toys. These children looked, on the surface, like the easiest ones in the room. Ainsworth called this avoidant attachment, but the appearances were deceiving. Later research showed that the avoidant children's heart rates told a different story. Their bodies were just as aroused, just as activated by the separation as the other children's. They had simply learned not to show it. They had learned in the way that bodies learn, before thought or language, that showing the need did not bring the comfort, and so they had turned it inward, quiet on the outside, still alarmed on the inside. Here is why this stays in the mind once you hear it. Because many of us are those children grown up. We carry our attachment patterns with us the way we carry our posture, invisibly, automatically, without choosing to. They show up in how we enter a new relationship, how we respond when someone is late to reply, how we feel in the silence after a difficult conversation. They show up in the nights when we cannot sleep and do not quite know why. And here is what Bowlby always wanted us to understand. These patterns were not flaws. They were solutions. They were the best available strategy given what was there, given what the infant's world offered. The anxious child learned to intensify the signal because intensity sometimes worked. The avoidant child learned to suppress the signal because suppression kept the peace. Neither is a failure. Both are forms of intelligence, but both carry a cost that follows us into adulthood. And understanding that cost, seeing it clearly and gently, is the first step towards something different. Chapter 5. The Secure Base. There is a house you have probably imagined. Maybe not in those terms, maybe not a house exactly, but a place, a feeling, a condition of being in which you feel safe enough to be curious, safe enough to venture out, safe enough to risk something, safe enough to fail and come back and try again. John Bowlby called this the secure base. And it is, he argued, one of the most important gifts one human being can offer another. Think of what a securely attached child actually does. They do not cling to their caregiver all day. They do not stay pressed against the leg, afraid to move. On the contrary, the securely attached child is often the most adventurous. They will move out into the room, explore a new toy, approach a stranger, crawl toward an interesting object. But every few minutes, they check back. A glance, a brief return. Sometimes just a look across the room that says, "You are still there." And if the caregiver responds with a nod, a smile, a simple acknowledgement, the child turns away again and continues exploring. The secure base does not hold the child still. It sets the child free. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest. This is the paradox that Bowlby spent his life trying to explain to a world that wanted to believe that neediness and dependence were simply things to be outgrown. He wanted to show that the capacity for healthy independence grows directly out of the experience of healthy dependence. You cannot have one without the other. The child who was held when they needed holding eventually learns that the world is safe enough to explore. The child who was left to manage alone too often, too early, learns something different. They learn to manage. But the managing costs something. It costs the ease that comes from knowing that if the worst happens, someone will come. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the times when you have taken a risk, a new job, a difficult conversation, a move to an unfamiliar place. Think about what made that possible. Now think about what was under the courage. For most people, if they trace it back, there is a person. Someone whose voice is in the back of their mind. A parent who believed in them. A teacher who saw something. A friend who said, "Go, I will be here when you get back." A partner whose presence made the world less frightening, even if that person was not literally present. Their presence, their imprint on your internal world, was the ground you were standing on. This is what Bowlby meant by the secure base. It does not disappear when the person leaves the room. If the Bowlby experience of being held has been consistent enough, deep enough, real enough, it becomes internalized. It becomes part of the architecture of the self, and from that internal secure base you can explore, you can tolerate uncertainty, you can take risks. You can face difficult emotions without being overwhelmed. Not because you are fearless, because you know at some level beneath thought that you are not entirely alone. But here is the quieter question that follows from this. What about those of us for whom that base was uncertain, shaky, present sometimes but not others, available in some ways and absent in others? What happens to the capacity for exploration then? We are getting there. Hold this gently. There is a scene from Bowlby's research files that stays in the mind. A toddler in an unfamiliar playroom, its mother sitting quietly in a chair by the door. The child ventures out, moves toward a pile of blocks, stacks one, looks up at the mother. She smiles. The child turns back and stacks another. Then a stranger enters the room. Something in the child changes. The blocks are abandoned. The child moves back toward the mother, presses against her leg. The mother puts her hand lightly on the child's back. The child stands there for a moment. Just a moment. Then, slowly, tentatively, begins to venture out again. Not because the stranger has been proved harmless, because the base was confirmed to be solid. And that confirmation, that light hand on the back, was enough. Enough to allow curiosity to outrun fear. Enough to allow exploration to continue in the presence of uncertainty. This is the secure base in action. Not a cage. Not an anchor. A launching point. And Bowlby wanted us to understand that every human being at every age still needs this. The adult who ventures into a difficult conversation is reaching back to that same ground. The person who takes on something new and frightening is operating, consciously or not, from whatever version of a secure base they have been able to build. And the quality of that base, how solid it feels, how reliable it seems, how available it is when the stranger enters the room, shapes everything that follows. The secure base is not only something you receive from another person, it is also something you can. with enough understanding and enough support, begin to build for yourself. That is the hope at the center of Bowlby's work. Not that our early experiences determine us forever, but that understanding them, seeing them clearly, with honesty and compassion, is the beginning of building something new. Chapter 6. Anxiety in Separation. You may remember a moment from childhood, or you may not remember it directly. It may only be present as a feeling, something your body knows better than your mind does. The moment when someone important left, and you did not yet know if they were coming back. Every child faces this moment in 1,000 ordinary forms: a parent going to work, a caregiver leaving a room, a temporary illness that kept the familiar person away. In the early years of life, these moments of separation are, for the child, genuinely alarming. Not because the child is unreasonable, because the child does not yet have the cognitive capacity to understand that absence is temporary. The caregiver who leaves the room has, in the child's present moment experience, simply gone. There is no reassuring she will be back in a minute, stored reliably in the nervous system yet. There is only the loss and the alarm that loss triggers. Bowlby called this separation anxiety, and he was careful to say, this is not pathology, this is function. The alarm that sounds when attachment is threatened exists because attachment is necessary. A child who did not alarm at separation, who did not protest, did not call out, did not signal distress when the person who kept them safe moved away, was a child in serious evolutionary danger. The alarm is the survival mechanism. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Notice the weight of your body for just a moment. The floor, or the bed, or the cushion beneath you, let yourself feel it. The alarm is designed for a specific purpose: to signal the caregiver to return, and then to be quiet again once the caregiver has returned. Signal, contact, soothing, release. That is the natural arc. But what happens when the caregiver does not return? Or returns unpredictably? Or returns in body, but not in emotional availability? The alarm system cannot quite switch off. It stays activated on low, a kind of hum in the background of daily life. And over time, that hum becomes the baseline. This is one of the mechanisms behind what we later call anxiety, not the word anxiety as it is used in ordinary conversation, to mean nerves before an important event, but anxiety in its deeper form. The kind that lives in the body that does not have a clear cause. That shows up in relationships, in the night, in the moments between moments when everything is fine and yet something is not. Bowlby believed that much of adult anxiety has its roots in exactly this place, not in conscious memory. Not in events that the person can point to and say, that is why I am this way. In the early nervous system's learning that the world is not quite predictable, that the safe person might or might not be available, that the signal for help might or might not bring help. And from that learning, a chronic low-level vigilance watching for signs, reading faces. Hyper-aware of tone, of silence, of the small cues that tell whether someone is emotionally close or emotionally far. If any of that sounds familiar, you are not alone. It sounds familiar to most human beings who have ever paused long enough to listen to what their nervous system is saying. Here is a thing that Bowlby noticed in his clinical work. The patients who were most troubled by anxiety, who experienced its effects most profoundly and most consistently, were often the patients who had the most difficulty recognizing it for what it was. They did not say, "I am anxious," because the attachment system is responding to perceived unavailability. They said, "I am stressed, I am overwhelmed, I am irritable, I cannot sleep, I cannot focus, something is wrong, but I cannot tell you what." The anxiety had become so much the background of daily life that it was no longer experienced as anxiety. It was experienced as the texture of existence itself. This is one of the things that makes insecure attachment difficult to recognize in adult life. The patterns it creates are so familiar, so continuous, so woven into the fabric of daily experience that they feel like personality rather than response. The hypervigilance feels like conscientiousness. The difficulty trusting feels like wisdom. The pulling back feels like self-protection. The constant monitoring of tone and expression feels like emotional intelligence. And each of these things can be, in certain circumstances, exactly what they appear to be. But underneath them, often, is the hum, the old alarm running quietly, colouring everything. And the remarkable thing, the thing that Bowlby always found worth pointing toward, is that simply naming it changes something, not immediately, not completely. But naming it as old, as learned, as a response to something historical rather than an accurate reading of the present, creates the first crack of light in a long closed room. Here is the quieter layer beneath the anxiety. The alarm was never meant to frighten you. It was meant to help you. It is an old, loyal signal that never quite learned it was safe to rest. Understanding it, seeing it as an old friend with an outdated job description, is not the same as being cured of it, but it is different from fearing it. And that difference is the first opening. Chapter 7. Protest against distance. When a child is separated from its primary caregiver, Bowlby observed that the response follows a pattern, not always identical in its details, but recognizable in its shape. He called the first phase protest. The child cries loudly, clings to anyone who might help, searches the environment with its eyes, reaches toward every door the caregiver might walk through, resists comfort from anyone else, will not be distracted, will not be calmed, will not be redirected. Everything in the child is oriented toward one goal: bring the person back. And this makes complete evolutionary sense. The protest is loud because loudness worked. The child who cried hard was the child who was heard, who was found, who was returned to safety. The protest is also emotional because emotion communicates in ways that reason cannot. It is not only volume, it is the urgency, the desperation, the quality of the cry that is unlike any other, distinctive, compelling, designed to cut through noise and land in the nervous system of the person who hears it. Let the next breath be a little slower. Just notice the air as it arrives. Now think about this for a moment. Think about how you respond when someone important becomes distant. Not physically, though that too, but emotionally distant. When a person you care about becomes cooler, less available, harder to reach, what does the response feel like in your body? For many people, it is a form of protest. Not always a loud one, not always a visible one, but internally a searching, a reaching, a heightened alertness to every signal. More messages sent than would be sent otherwise. More checking, more wondering. More replaying of the last conversation, looking for the moment things changed. Or the opposite, a withdrawal so complete that it looks like indifference. But beneath the indifference, the same searching is happening, just turned inward. Bowlby's contribution here was to say, these adult responses are not signs of emotional immaturity. They are not proof that you need to grow up or be less sensitive or learn to handle things better. They are the protest behavior of the attachment system. The ancient signal firing as it was designed to fire. In the child, the signal is appropriate. In the adult, it can become confusing because the threat that triggers it is often not a life-threatening abandonment. It is a partner who is distracted, a friend who takes a day to reply, a colleague who seems cooler than usual. But the nervous system does not always distinguish between the size of the threat. It distinguishes between presence and absence, near and far, safe and uncertain. And when it registers uncertain, when the attachment figure seems unavailable, the protest system activates. This is why a small distance can create a large response. This is why a brief silence can feel like a world ending. Not because you are unreasonable, because your nervous system learned very early what distance can mean, and it has been paying attention ever since.
The mind repeats what the heart has not been allowed to finish. And the protest that could not complete its journey in childhood, that reached and was not held, that cried and was not answered, looks for its resolution in the adult relationships that follow. Not because you are stuck, because something in you is still trying to finish the story. And understanding that changes what you ask of yourself. It changes what you might, with gentleness, begin to offer. Chapter 8, Despair After Silence. If the protest continues and the caregiver does not return, something shifts. Bowlby observed this in young children who had been separated from their parents for extended periods. He watched it carefully, and he named what he saw. After the protest, after the loud, searching, urgent alarm, comes something quieter. Despair. The child becomes subdued.
less active, less reactive to the environment, withdrawn into itself. Occasionally still crying, but no longer with the urgency of protest. The crying, when it comes, is different now, lower, more monotone, as if the energy required for full protest has been spent, and what remains is a kind of grieving. The child is not okay. But from a distance, a casual observer might mistake what they see for calm. They might say, the child has settled. The child has adjusted. The child is fine. The child is not fine. The child is in a state that Bowlby recognized as something very close to what we call depression in adults. And this is one of the places where his work caused the most controversy. Because in the 1950s and 60s, the dominant view was that children were remarkably resilient, that they adapted, that as long as their physical needs were met, they were essentially all right. Bowlby looked at the children and saw something different. Let your eyes rest. Let the darkness behind your eyelids be soft. He was helped in making this visible by a remarkable collaborator, a man named James Robertson. Robertson was a social worker who had come to work with Bowlby at the Tavistock Clinic in London. And he had an idea that was, in the 1950s, genuinely radical. He wanted to bring a camera into a hospital. In 1952, he filmed a 2-year-old girl named Laura who had been admitted to a hospital for a routine operation. In that era, hospital policy did not allow parents to stay with their children. Visits were brief and infrequent. The assumption was that this was fine, children adapted, nurses were caring, the medical work was what mattered. Robertson filmed what actually happened. Laura, who had been described by her parents as a cheerful, secure child, moved through the phases that Bowlby would later codify. First protest, loud, searching, distressed. Then the gradual subsiding into something more internal. Then the third stage, which was the one that Robertson found hardest to watch, detachment. The stage in which Laura seemed, on the surface, to have recovered. She ate. She responded to nurses. She played a little. But when her mother came to visit, Laura did not run to her. She turned away. The film was shown to pediatricians, to hospital administrators, to policymakers. Many were troubled by what they saw. Some were defensive. But the images could not be argued with. A child separated from her mother, moving through protest and despair, and then into something that looked like calm, but was actually something else. Something was being lost. Something that mattered. And Bowlby's question, quiet but insistent, was this: what do we do with this knowledge? The despair phase is not the end of the story, but it is important that we see it clearly, because many of us carry a version of it. Not from one dramatic hospitalization, not from a single clear event that we can point to, but from the accumulated experience of reaching and not finding, of needing and not receiving, of learning slowly and wordlessly that the loudness of the need does not guarantee that the need will be met. And when a need goes unmet, often enough, something changes. Not the need itself, the trust that expressing it will make any difference. That is the quiet cost of the despair phase. And it does not vanish when childhood ends. It becomes, instead, a kind of armor, and we call it something else in adulthood. We call it independence, or self-reliance, or not needing much. But inside the armor, something is still waiting. And here is a story that illuminates how invisible this can become. A man in his late 50s, recently retired, comes to see a therapist. Not because he is in crisis, because he has, unexpectedly, begun waking at 3 a.m. and cannot return to sleep. He describes himself as fine, as having had, by most measures, a very successful life, a long marriage, children who are launched and doing well, a career that was productive, and yet 3 a.m, wide awake. Nothing on his mind, he says, exactly, just awake. Over the course of several months, as the therapist asks careful questions, something emerges. He has been fine his entire life, reliably, consistently, almost remarkably fine. And beneath the fine, beneath decades of managing and producing and maintaining the steady composure that everyone around him had always counted on, was a small, quiet, very patient stillness. Waiting for conditions safe enough to feel what had never been felt. He had not grown up in a dramatically difficult home. The difficulties were quiet ones, the kind that leave no visible marks. A father who was present but not quite reachable. A mother who was warm in her way but anxious, and whose anxiety had made her sometimes intrusive and sometimes absent in ways that were hard to predict. The man had learned before he had words for learning that the safest strategy was to be fine, to need very little, to manage. And he had managed very successfully for 58 years. 3 a.m. was the armor softening at last, not a crisis, a beginning. And inside the armor, something was still waiting. Chapter 9. Detachment as defense. There is a particular kind of person who worries the people who love them, not because they are dramatic or difficult, but because they are so composed, nothing seems to touch them too deeply. They handle setbacks with equanimity that borders on the uncanny. They do not often ask for help. They do not often admit to struggle. In conversation, they can be warm and engaging, and yet there is a quality of distance that is hard to describe, a glass pane between them and the world. Bowlby had a name for what was happening beneath the surface. He called it detachment. In the child, detachment was the third phase of the separation response. After protest, after despair, the child who had been separated too long, without adequate comfort, eventually stopped showing the distress that the distress had not resolved, stopped protesting, stopped grieving visibly, seemed to outside observers to have recovered. But what had actually happened was more complicated. The attachment behavioral system had not switched off. It had been pushed underground. The child had learned not in words, but in the deep, wordless learning of the early nervous system that showing the need created more pain than not showing it, that the vulnerability of needing was not safe, that the person who might have helped was either not there or not able to help or made things worse when asked. And so the child made an adaptation. Keep the need. Quiet the signal. Let your hands rest open. There is nothing to hold on to right now. In adult life, detachment becomes a style, a way of moving through the world that has often very genuine strengths. People who learned early to depend on themselves can become remarkably capable, competent, resourceful, able to function in difficult conditions without falling apart. These are real skills. Bowlby was not trying to pathologize them, but he was asking a harder question: at what cost? The cost appears often in the places where intimacy is required, in the moment when a partner reaches out and the person cannot quite reach back. Not because they do not want to, but because the part of them that knows how to reach was so thoroughly trained not to that it has, in a sense, forgotten the motion. In the moment, after loss, after a death, a divorce, a significant ending, when the grief does not quite arrive, when the person finds themselves oddly functional, moving through the necessary tasks, not breaking down. And then, months later, something small happens. A song comes on the radio. A smell triggers a memory. And what has been held so carefully for so long suddenly, without warning, surfaces. The body has kept the account even when the mind would not. Think of a man in his 60s sitting alone in his kitchen at 3 a.m. His wife of 31 years passed away 8 months ago. He is doing fine by his own accounting. He has managed, he has kept busy. He is not one for making a fuss. But he has stopped sleeping well. He gets up and stands in the kitchen and cannot quite remember why he got up. What he is standing in is not insomnia. It is grief that found its way through the only door that was left open. Detachment protects us from the sharpness of pain, but it also keeps us from the warmth of connection. The glass pane that keeps hurt out also keeps closeness at arm's length. And the tragedy, as Bowlby saw it, was not that people had learned to protect themselves. The tragedy was that many of them did not know they were doing it. They had lived inside the glass so long that they had mistaken it for the air. Understanding this, even just seeing it, just naming it, is not nothing. Because once you can see the glass, you can wonder whether it still needs to be there. And that wondering is the beginning of something. Chapter 10, the first emotional map. By the time a child reaches the age of 2 or 3, something remarkable has already happened. In the wordless layers of the developing brain, a map has been drawn. Not a map of streets or territories, a map of the emotional world. A representation of how relationships work. Who is safe and who is not. What to expect when you need something. Whether reaching out brings comfort or brings silence. Bowlby called this an internal working model, and it is one of his most important and far-reaching ideas. The internal working model is a kind of template, a mental and emotional blueprint built from the accumulated experience of early attachment. It is not a set of consciously held beliefs. It is deeper than that. It operates mostly below awareness, as a set of expectations and automatic responses that the person carries into every relationship that follows. Think of it this way. If you grew up in a house where the light switch reliably turned the light on, you will walk into a new house and, without thinking about it, reach for the switch in the place you expect it to be. You will not consciously reason about where switches are placed. You will simply reach. The internal working model works similarly. If your early experience taught you that reaching brings comfort, that the person who mattered was reliably available, reliably responsive, reliably soothing, then you will move through your adult relationships with that expectation as your invisible ground. You will not consciously think, I can trust this person. You will simply feel, more or less, that trust is available. If your early experience taught you something else, that reaching sometimes brings help and sometimes brings nothing, that availability is unpredictable, that people you love will sometimes be there and sometimes not, then the map will be different, and you will reach with one hand and hold back with the other. Feel the surface beneath you. Just the simple fact of being held by something solid. You do not have to do anything with that. Just notice. Bowlby was careful to say that internal working models are not destiny. They are not fixed. They are not prison sentences. They are working models, which means they are built to be updated, built to incorporate new information, built to be revised in the light of new experience. The model that says, I cannot be trusted, can, over time, and with the right relational experiences, be rewritten. Not easily, not quickly, but the capacity for revision is there. This is one of the hopeful threads that runs through all of Bowlby's work. He did not believe that early experience sealed people forever. He believed it, shaped them in ways that could be understood. And that understanding, real understanding, the kind that reaches the body and not just the mind, was itself a form of healing. But before we can understand how models change, we need to understand what happens when the early model is built in difficult conditions. What happens when the map is drawn in uncertainty? When the first emotional blueprint of the world says, sometimes you will be held, sometimes you will not. And you cannot know from moment to moment which it will be. That map has a name, and it produces a very particular kind of life, a very particular way of loving, of fearing, of way, of reaching and withdrawing and reaching again. We are going to spend some time in that territory, not to linger in pain, but to understand it clearly enough that it stops surprising us, because what you understand can no longer sneak up on you in the dark. And here is the first open loop we can begin to close. We said at the beginning of this night that there is a kind of pain that has no name, the pain that lives in the body without a clear address, the ache that arrives in the quiet. The map Bowlby drew for us, the map of attachment and internal working, models and the learned expectations that live below awareness, is the beginning of an address for that pain. It says, the ache is not random, it is not meaningless. It is not evidence of something wrong with you that cannot be named or understood. It is the nervous system's memory of the first map it was given. And memories, unlike fates, can be understood, can be held at arm's length, just far enough to see clearly, can be revised slowly and with patience and with the right kind of presence. The map was drawn a long time ago, but you are holding the pen now. Chapter 11. Internal Working Models. The model has a voice. Most of the time, you do not recognize it as a voice. It does not speak in complete sentences. It speaks in feelings, in the tightening of the chest when someone does not respond to a message, in the pulling back that happens just as something good is beginning, in the exhaustion that comes from monitoring everything, every tone of voice, every shift in expression, in the people you care about. The model is always running in the background, making predictions, assigning meaning, telling you what is about to happen before it has happened, based on what happened before, long before you can remember. John Bowlby described the internal working model as the mental representation of the self in relation to others. Not just a belief about other people, but a belief about yourself, what you deserve, whether you are the kind of person who gets to be loved with consistency, whether the people you depend on will stay. It is a double model, a model of the other, available or not, trustworthy or not, likely to stay or likely to leave, and a model of the self, lovable or not, worthy of protection or not, worthy of the effort required to be truly close. These two models, of others and of self, develop together. They are mirror images of each other. The child whose caregivers were reliably available tends to develop a model that says, others can be trusted, and I am the kind of person who deserves to be trusted. The child whose caregivers were often unavailable or unpredictable tends to develop a model that says, others may not be there when I need them, and perhaps there is something about me that makes it difficult to get what I need. That second model is not a conclusion anyone drew consciously. It was simply the pattern that formed in the dark. Let your breathing slow a little now. Let the exhale be just slightly longer than the inhale. The reason internal working models matter so much in adult life is that they operate outside of conscious awareness. You do not decide to. Interpret your partner's quiet mood as a sign of impending abandonment. You simply feel it. The feeling arrives before the thought, before any possibility of questioning it. This is why insight alone is often not enough. You can understand intellectually that your anxiety about closeness comes from early experience. You can read every book, attend every workshop, talk about it in therapy for years. And still, when someone important goes quiet, the nervous system fires its old alarm. The model is not stored in the part of the brain that responds to understanding. It is stored deeper in the part of the brain that governs automatic response. Threat detection. The reading of faces and tones and silences before conscious thought can even begin to organize itself. This is why Bowlby always emphasized that healing happens in relationship, not in understanding alone, but in the actual lived experience of something different. The model that says people leave begins to change when someone consistently and over time does not leave. The model that says, I am too much, begins to soften when someone stays anyway. This is slow work. It is not linear. It doubles back on itself. It requires patience from everyone involved. But it is not impossible. And here is the thing that makes it beautiful and painful in equal measure. The longing you feel, the one that sits quietly under the surface and makes the nights long, is not a sign that you are broken. It is the model reaching for something it was designed to need. It is your nervous system across all the years still hoping that the story might end differently. And that hope, stubborn, quiet, persistent as it is not pathology. It is the proof that detachment never stopped mattering. Here is one more thing worth holding on to before we continue. The fear of abandonment, the one that lives. Behind so much of the anxiety, so much of the vigilance, so much of the relational difficulty that people carry is not evidence of fragility, it is evidence of depth. Only people who care deeply are afraid to lose what they care about. Only people who have known connection can fear its absence. The very intensity of the fear is proportional to the capacity for love. And the capacity for love, however complicated it has become, however overlaid with old pain and old patterns, and the learned strategies of a nervous system trying to stay safe, is not something to be fixed. It is something to be understood and honored, and with patience and gentleness and time, allowed to exist with a little less fear of its own intensity. And because it never stopped mattering, the door was never fully closed. Here is a question worth sitting with quietly before we move on. What is your working model of yourself in relationship? Not the answer you would give in a job interview, not the version you present on the good days, the quiet one. The one that shows up in the moments between moments. When someone you love does not text back quickly, when a silence falls in a conversation and you are not sure what it means, when you achieve something significant and the person you most want to tell is not available. What does the model say then? For some people, the model says, "This is fine. People are busy. The silence means nothing. I am solid in myself regardless." For others, the model says something more complicated, something about availability, about whether you are the kind of person whose company is truly wanted, about what the silence might really mean. Neither of these responses is chosen. They arrive before choosing. They are the model speaking in its oldest voice. And the value of knowing that, of recognizing the voice as old, as learned, as historical rather than current, is that it creates the possibility of a second response, a chosen one, not to override the feelings. Feelings cannot be overridden by decision, but to hold them differently, with curiosity rather than certainty, with the question, is this old or is this now? And sometimes, not always, not immediately, but sometimes, that question is enough to open a small crack of light. Chapter 12, Trauma in Early Distance. There is a kind of wound that does not look like a wound. It does not come from a single dramatic event. There is no clear moment you can point to and say, that is where it happened. There is no accident, no disaster, no visible mark. It comes from repetition, from the small, daily, ordinary experience of needing and not quite receiving, of asking and getting something close to an answer, but not quite the answer, of reaching out and finding hands that were sometimes there and sometimes not, and never knowing, moment to moment, which it would be. Bowlby spent years thinking about this kind of wound. He was careful with the word trauma. He did not use it only for the extreme cases. He used it for what happens to the developing nervous system when the environment it depends on is unreliable, because the developing brain does not distinguish between big disruptions and small ones in the way that we, as adults looking back, might try to. The brain of a young child is building its core assumptions about the world, and those assumptions are built from what is actually there. If what is actually there is inconsistency, a caregiver who is warm and available on some days, and withdrawn or distracted or frightening on others, the nervous system does not average it out. It registers the unpredictability itself as the fundamental condition of the world. And from that registration, it builds accordingly. It builds for a world that cannot be trusted to be safe. Notice where your body holds tension right now. Maybe the shoulders, maybe the jaw, maybe a tightness somewhere in the chest or the stomach. You do not need to change it, just notice. One of the researchers who extended Bowlby's work in this direction was Mary Main, who, with her colleagues, identified a fourth attachment pattern beyond the three that Ainsworth had described. She called it disorganized attachment. It appeared in children whose caregivers were themselves frightening, not necessarily abusive in ways that outside observers would recognize, but frightening to the child. sometimes withdrawn to the point of being emotionally absent, sometimes frightening in their own unresolved fear or grief. What these children faced was an impossible situation. The person who was supposed to be their source of safety was also the source of their alarm. Come close, because I am afraid. But the thing I am afraid of is you. And in that impossible bind, the organizing system of attachment, protest, despair, detachment broke down. Because it had nowhere to go. These children showed behavior that was, in its way, heartbreaking. Approaches that stopped mid-motion, freezing, simultaneous reaching and turning away. A disorganization of behavior that reflected the disorganization of the inner world. Many of us were not raised by caregivers who were frightening in this clinical sense, but many of us were raised by caregivers who were themselves struggling with depression, with their own unresolved losses, with lives that left little room for the steady presence that an attachment system requires. And the child of a struggling parent, a parent who was doing their honest best in difficult conditions, still experiences the gaps, still feels the moments of absence, still builds a nervous system calibrated to an uncertain world. This is not about blame. Bowlby was not interested in blame. He was interested in understanding, and what he understood is this: the wounds of early distance are real. They are written into the body. They are carried forward, but they are not invisible. And what can be seen can be worked with. There is a woman in her late 40s who spent years in therapy understanding her childhood. Her mother had been depressed for most of the woman's early years. Not dramatically, not in a way that attracted outside attention, just absent. Present in the room and absent in the quality of attention she brought to it. The woman had grown up believing this was normal, that the faint, constant, low-level loneliness of her childhood was simply what childhood felt like. It was not until she had her own children that something shifted. She looked at her infant daughter, looking back at her. She felt the pull to be fully present, genuinely, attentively present. And she realized in that moment that the pull she was feeling was new, that she had never been looked at that way, that the gaze she was now offering her daughter was the gaze she had needed and not received, and she grieved something. Quietly, in that moment, not with drama, just with a settling clarity. The wound was visible now, and visible wounds, this is what Bowlby always believed, can begin to close. That is the beginning of something different. Chapter 13. Maternal Deprivation Revisited. In 1951, Bowlby wrote a report for the World Health Organization on the mental health of homeless children in post-war Europe. In it, he made a claim that would be debated for decades. He argued that the continuous care of a mother, or a permanent mother substitute, was essential for the mental health of the developing child. And that deprivation of this care in the early years had lasting effects. He called it maternal deprivation. The report was widely read and widely misunderstood. Critics accused him of putting impossible pressure on mothers. of reducing the entire complexity of child development to the question of whether a mother stayed home, of ignoring the role of fathers, siblings, community, culture. Some of those critiques had validity. Bowlby himself, in his later work, refined and corrected his earlier formulations. He was clear that mother was shorthand for primary caregiver, the one person who provided the consistent, warm, emotionally available presence that the attachment system required. That person did not have to be female, did not have to be a biological parent. What mattered was the continuity, the reliability, the emotional availability. What mattered was that the child had a person, a specific, consistent, genuinely present person who was there. Let your breath settle. Let the next few moments be slow. What he was pointing toward underneath the controversy was something important. The human nervous system is not designed to develop in isolation. It is designed to be shaped by relationship. To use relationship as its primary environment in the same way that a plant uses soil, a plant grown in poor soil may grow, but it will grow differently than it would have in rich conditions. It will develop survival strategies, growing toward whatever light is available, conserving resources, becoming cautious. That would not have been necessary in better soil. And some of those strategies will stay with it, not because the plant is damaged beyond repair, but because the body remembers the conditions it grew in, even when the conditions change. Bowlby was not saying that children needed perfect mothers. He was not saying they needed mothers who were always present, always patient, always attuned. He was saying they needed someone who was there enough, consistent enough, responsive enough, emotionally available enough. Someone who, when the child looked up, was looking back. The small moments of meeting, the glance returned, the cry answered, the distress soothed are not trivial. They are the building blocks of the nervous system's belief that the world is a place where help exists. And when those moments are absent more than they are present, when the child looks up and finds the gaze averted or distracted or simply not there, the nervous system draws its conclusions accordingly. Not in words, in patterns. In the patterns that eventually show up in how you love, how you argue, how you sleep, how you respond when someone you care about is quiet for longer than feels comfortable. The good news, and Bowlby was always looking for the good news, even when the research was difficult, is that patterns can be interrupted, not erased, not overnight, but interrupted gently through the experience of what was missing. And that interruption is possible at any age. That is the thread we are holding tonight. Chapter 14, The Fear of Abandonment. There is a fear that lives at the center of many human difficulties. It rarely announces itself by name. It arrives in disguise, as anger, as withdrawal, as the compulsive need to please, as the exhausting vigilance that never quite lets you rest. But at the center of it, when you look closely enough, is this: the fear of being left. Not just the practical fear of being alone. That is something different. Something that can be addressed with plans and company and distraction. The fear of being left is older than plans, older than reason. It is the nervous system's memory of what happened the last time the person who mattered disappeared. And for many people, that memory is stored not in the mind, but in the body. It lives in the way the chest tightens when a partner seems distant, in the checking and rechecking of a phone, in the elaborate calculations of whether it is safe to say what you actually feel, or whether saying it will push the person away, in the dreams that come in the night, sometimes where someone important is always just out of reach. Bowlby called this chronic anxiety about the availability of attachment figures. It is not neurosis. It is not weakness. It is the attachment system doing exactly what it was designed to do: monitoring, scanning, alerting. But monitoring an absence that may or may not be happening. Alerting to a threat that is more historical than present. Let your jaw unclench for a moment. Let your shoulders soften. There is nothing to protect yourself from right now. Think of a woman in her early 50s, sitting across a restaurant table from a man she has been with for 3 years. He is looking at his phone. She does not know what she is looking at when she looks at him. She sees the phone and feels something that she would call, if pressed, anxiety. But it is more specific than that. It is the silence, the moment of not quite being seen, and in that moment, something ancient and automatic fires. Not a reasonable assessment of what the phone means, but a whole-body response to a familiar signal, the signal that says, "You are on your own now, be careful." She has worked on this in therapy. She understands, intellectually, that her father's disappearances when she was young left a template in her nervous system. She understands it, and it helps. Somewhat. But the body fires the alarm before the understanding has time to catch up. This is the nature of the fear of abandonment. It is faster than thought. It is built from years of accumulated pattern, and it responds not to logic, but to safety. What gradually changes it is not understanding it, though understanding is part of it. What changes it is the slow, repeated, embodied experience of, "I expected to be left here, and I was not. I showed too much, and you stayed. I asked for something, and you gave it. I was afraid and said so." And the fear was met with warmth rather than distance. These small moments of disconfirmation, of the nervous system's old prediction being gently proved wrong, are the mechanism of change. They do not happen quickly, but they happen. And knowing that they can happen is itself a kind of relief. Chapter 15. Clinging and Withdrawal. When the attachment system is activated in conditions of uncertainty, it produces two responses that look completely opposite, but are, in fact, the same. The first is clinging, the reaching, the following, the holding on, the need to close the distance, to make contact, to restore the proximity that felt safe, the need to call one more time, to check in one more time, to make sure. The second is withdrawal, the pulling back, the going quiet, the becoming unreachable. The deliberate creation of distance before distance can be imposed. The preemptive retreat that says, I will leave before you can leave me. Two completely different behaviors. One anxious ambivalent, one avoidant. Both are protest. Both are the attachment system trying to manage an unbearable situation. The clinging person and the withdrawing person are, at the level of the nervous system, in identical distress. They simply learned different strategies for managing it. And when they meet in a relationship, as they often do, because these patterns tend toward each other with something like gravitational pull, the result is a dance that is both intimate and exhausting. The clinging person reaches, the withdrawing person steps back. The reaching person reaches further. The withdrawing person steps further back. And the more distance there is, the more alarmed the reaching person becomes. And the more alarm the reaching person shows, the more overwhelmed the withdrawing person feels. And the more overwhelmed they feel, the further they withdraw. Round and round, each person doing exactly what their nervous system learned to do, each person from inside their own experience making complete sense, each person to the other seeming impossible. Let the next breath be slow and complete. Nothing needs to be solved right now. Bowlby spent time thinking about this dynamic. He was not surprised by it. It made complete theoretical sense. The two insecure attachment strategies are, in a way, mirror images of each other. One maximizes attachment behavior, turns up the signal. One minimizes it, turns the signal down or off. And when they meet in a relationship, the strategies collide in ways that feel both unbearable and oddly familiar. Oddly familiar because both people at some level already know this territory. They have been here before. Not with this person, but with the early version. The first time the distance felt threatening. The first time the reaching was not met. The first time they learned what they needed to do to manage that feeling. The dance in the adult relationship is a recapitulation, not a repetition of the same relationship, but a repetition of the same nervous system. Response to the same felt threat. And here is what matters. Both people are capable of something different. Not because they simply decide to try harder, but because with enough understanding of themselves, of each other, of the ancient logic underneath the pattern, both of them can begin to do something that their nervous systems did not originally learn to do, to stay. When the urge is to flee, to stay. When the urge is to reach harder, to pause, to interrupt the dance, not by fighting it, but by understanding it. There is a couple who have been together for 11 years. She grew up in a home where she never quite knew what version of her mother she would find when she came home from school. Some days warmth, some days silence, some days a door closed and no explanation given. He grew up in a home where he learned early that the safest place was his own room. That needing something was more likely to create trouble than comfort. That it was better to be fine. Now, in their marriage, they circle each other like planets in misaligned orbits. She reaches. He moves back. She reaches harder. He closes off. And afterward, in the silence that follows, neither of them quite knows what just happened. She does not know she is in protest. He does not know he is in detachment. Each of them is doing exactly what their nervous system learned to do in conditions of threat. And each of them, from inside their own experience, is making complete and reasonable sense. This is the extraordinary thing about attachment patterns in adult relationships. They are not drama. They are not manipulation. They are not immaturity or selfishness or failure to love correctly. They are the nervous system doing its job. The job it was given a long time ago by a world that was the only world it had. It is slow work. It requires patience. But it is possible. And in the slow, patient interruption of these old patterns lies something that looks a great deal like healing. Chapter 16, Love Under Threat. Love, Bowlby argued, is not a feeling that sits still. It is a system, a dynamic, ongoing, constantly monitored process of calibration between self and other. An ancient coordination of need and response, of signal and reply, of distance and closeness. And because it is a system, it responds to threat. Not always dramatically, not always with the loud protest of a child calling out for a caregiver. Sometimes with something much quieter, a slight increase in vigilance, a holding back of vulnerability, a careful tending of the inner life, the real one, because the outer relationship does not feel quite safe enough to hold it. You may have noticed this in your own life. The way that love, under certain conditions, becomes careful, strategic, even. You give a certain amount, enough to feel connected, not so much that you are exposed. You express yourself up to a point and then stop. You let someone close, but not all the way close. And this carefulness is not dishonesty. It is the attachment system doing what it knows how to do, managing risk, maintaining some internal sanctuary, some part of the self that is not contingent on the stability of the other person. Just for a moment, let your hands open, palms up. Just for a moment. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She was not writing about attachment theory, but she was describing something that Bowlby would recognize. Because what the attachment system needs more than anything, more than grand gestures, more than declarations, is attention. The simple, consistent, reliable presence of another person's attention. Not constant attention, not perfect attention, just enough, just regular enough. Just present enough that the nervous system can feel, I am not alone in this. When love comes under threat, when the attention of the person we depend on becomes uncertain or directed elsewhere or withdrawn, the attachment system alarms. And the alarm does not care how reasonable the threat is. It does not weigh the circumstances. It simply fires. And the firing feels from inside like emergency, like something must be done right now. And what gets done? The clinging, the withdrawing, the anger, the silence, the careful management is the emergency response, the system trying to restore what it most needs. The question that Bowlby's work opens for all of us is not how to stop the alarm from firing. That is not possible. The system is too old, too deep, too built into the structure of the nervous system. The question is what we do with the alarm when it fires, whether we react from inside it or whether we can, with practice and with understanding, stand just slightly outside it, long enough to ask, what is actually happening here? Long enough to notice this feeling is old, long enough to make a choice that the nervous system on its own would not have made. That space between the alarm and the action, tiny, hard to find, easy to miss, is where something new becomes possible. Think of a man in his early 40s who cannot understand why, when his partner comes home tired and quiet, something cold moves through his chest. Nothing is wrong. She has said she is tired. It is a Tuesday. There is no reason. And yet the cold comes. A tightening, a holding back, a careful arrangement of the inner world so that whatever is happening inside is not visible. He does not ask how her day was with any warmth. He becomes slightly absent. And she notices, but she too has learned not to ask, because asking when someone is absent sometimes makes the absence worse. And the night passes in a minor disconnection that neither of them could fully explain. What is happening is not a marriage problem. It is an attachment problem wearing the clothes of an ordinary evening. His nervous system heard she is unavailable. And it did what it learned to do when something important became unavailable. It braced. It went slightly cold. It protected the inner territory. And the protection, necessary and automatic and entirely unconscious, created the very distance it was designed to defend against. This is how it works. Not in catastrophic events, in ordinary evenings, in the quiet accumulation of small moments of defensive closing, until one day you look up and wonder why there is a distance between you that you cannot quite explain and did not quite choose. And the answer, if you are patient and honest enough to look for it, is this. The closing was the answer to a fear, and the fear was older than the marriage. And tonight, we are learning to find that space. Chapter 17, When Self-Worth Breaks. There is a thought that arrives for many people, usually in the quiet. It does not always have words. Sometimes it is just a feeling, a subtle sense of being less than, of not quite measuring up, of being the kind of person for whom certain things are simply not available. Connection, consistent love, the ease of being chosen. When this feeling has words, they are often some version of this: there is something wrong with me. Bowlby understood this thought, this belief, this felt sense of deficiency as one of the lasting consequences of insecure early attachment. Not because people are broken, but because the internal working model includes a model of the self, and a child who experienced early caregiving as unreliable, as intermittent, as present and then absent without apparent reason, that child does not only conclude that the world is uncertain, they conclude that they are the reason, not in words, not in conscious thought, but in the wordless logic of a nervous system trying to make sense of its experience. If the person who is supposed to love me does not seem to find me easy to love, then perhaps I am not easy to love. This is not a reasonable conclusion, but it is a common one, and it lodges in the body in ways that are very difficult to dislodge. Let your breath find its own rhythm. You do not need to make it anything. Just let it move as it wants to move. There is a researcher named Bessel van der Kolk who spent decades studying what happens to the body in conditions of chronic early stress. He found that these experiences are not only stored in memory, they are stored in the nervous system itself, in the tension of the shoulders, in the breath that never quite reaches the belly, in the startle response that fires too quickly, in the sense of being not quite at home in one's own skin. He found that healing these deep patterns often required work at the level of the body. Not just understanding, not just talking, but the actual physical experience of safety. And this aligns closely with what Bowlby always believed. The model of the self that says, "I am not quite lovable," was not built in the mind, it was built in the massy body, in the experience of reaching and not being met, in the experience of needing and being left alone with the need. And the revision of that model requires something that also reaches the body: the experience of being met, the experience of being seen, not in spite of vulnerability, but through it, the experience of expressing a need and having someone respond not with distance or discomfort, but with warmth. These experiences do not have to be perfectly orchestrated. They do not have to come from a therapist or a formal healing context. They can come from a friend, a partner, a conversation that goes somewhere real, a moment in which you said something true about yourself and the person across from you did not flinch. Each of those moments is a data point for the nervous system, a small revision to the model, a tentative loosening of the belief that there is something fundamentally wrong. The years teach what the days never could, and the model that took years to build requires years to revise. But it revises. It is capable of revision. That is the fact that matters most. As the night grows quiet and the mind slows toward rest. And here is one more quiet truth before we continue. The inner critic, that voice that arrives when you make a mistake, when you fall short, when you see your reflection in a way that does not please you, that voice is not yours. It was given to you by the environment, by the people who shaped the early years, by the accumulated experience of what was responded to with warmth and what was met with criticism or silence or disappointment. The voice learned its lines from someone else. It is performing a role that was assigned to it before you had any say. And understanding this, really understanding it, with the body as well as the mind, changes the relationship to the voice. You do not have to believe it just because it is familiar. You do not have to treat it as truth just because it speaks in your own register. It is an old voice with an old job in a world that has changed. And it can be answered, not with argument, with something quieter, with the voice that says, I hear you, and you are wrong about this. Chapter 18, Attachment in Adult Love. Bowlby always said that attachment is not something that belongs only to childhood. It is a feature of human life from the cradle to the grave. The attachment system does not switch off when we reach adulthood. It does not become irrelevant when we are old enough to provide for our own physical needs. It adapts. It shifts its primary focus from parent to partner, from primary caregiver to the particular person or people who have become our secure base in adult life. But the system remains, and it operates in adult love in ways that are remarkably similar to its operation in childhood. Think about what we actually look for in a romantic partner. Someone who is available, responsive, who takes us seriously, who does not disappear when things get difficult, who, when we are frightened or struggling or simply not at our best, stays anyway. We are looking, in other words, for a secure base, not always consciously, rarely in those terms, but the felt sense of what we most need from the people we love closely resembles the felt sense of what a child most needs from a caregiver: availability, responsiveness, a reliable presence in an uncertain world. Let the stillness hold you for a moment. There is nothing to figure out. A researcher named Philip Shaver, building on Bowlby's foundation, was one of the first to demonstrate systematically that adult romantic relationships function as attachment relationships. That the way people relate to their partners, the patterns of closeness and distance, of trust and anxiety, map directly onto the attachment patterns established in childhood. This does not mean that adult love is simply childhood attachment dressed up in grown-up clothes. It is more complex than that. Adult love involves reciprocity in a way that childhood attachment does not. Both partners ideally function as secure base for each other. Adult love involves sexuality, life projects, shared history, accumulated grievances and repairs and adaptations. But underneath all of that, underneath the shared mortgage and the 10-year arguments, and the particular way that one person knows which tone of voice the other needs on a bad day, underneath all of it, the attachment system is running, monitoring, evaluating, asking constantly and quietly, "Are you there? Will you be there? If I need you, can I trust this?" This is why adult love can feel so urgent. Why the loss of a significant relationship can feel not just painful, but catastrophic. Why the experience of being truly seen by another person, really seen, in the way that the best relationships occasionally allow, can feel like coming home. Because for the attachment system, it is coming home. It is the resolution of a need that is as old and as fundamental as the need for oxygen. The need to know that you are not alone. The need to know that if the darkness comes, there will be a presence in it. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that Bowlby found most moving in his quiet way, is that this need, far from being a weakness, is the very source of our capacity for everything that makes life most worth living. Courage, curiosity, creativity, the willingness to venture out into an uncertain world. All of it rooted in the ground of secure attachment. All of it possible because somewhere, at some level, there is the felt sense of a hand on your shoulder, even if the hand belongs to a memory, even if the person is gone. Think about what it would mean to give this understanding to someone in the middle of their grief. Not to tell them it will pass, not to remind them that time heals, but to say, what you are doing right now, the searching, the looking, the half expecting to find the person somewhere, is not a sign that you are not handling this well. It is the attachment system doing exactly what it was built to do. It is your nervous system's way of honoring the bond by refusing for a time to accept that it is gone. Bowlby found that people whose grief was complicated, who could not seem to move through it, who stayed in the searching phase for years, were often people whose attachment history had been insecure. Not because grief is harder for them, but because the searching for them was doing double work. It was searching for the person who had died, and it was searching for the availability that was never quite reliably there to begin with. The grief for a parent who was present, but not truly. Available is often one of the most complex griefs there is, because the loss is real, but what was lost was never fully possessed. You are grieving not only what was, you are grieving what might have been. And that grief, the grief for the relationship that did not quite happen, is one that our culture has very few words for. Bowlby wanted us to have those words. He wanted us to understand that this grief too is legitimate, that it deserves to be honored, that the searching that will not quite resolve is not pathology. It is the heart doing its work, even if you have to be the hand yourself. Chapter 19. Jealousy, panic, and protest. There is a feeling that most people are ashamed of. They do not talk about it at dinner parties. They rarely mention it to friends. They feel it in private, manage it in private, and present to the world a face that looks as though everything is fine. It is the particular panic that arrives when the person you love turns their attention elsewhere, not necessarily toward another person romantically, though that too, but the panic at simply being for a moment not the most important thing, not the person in the room they most want to talk to, not the one they check in with when the day has been difficult. The panic of being momentarily peripheral. We call this jealousy sometimes. And the word carries so much shame that it rarely gets examined honestly. But Bowlby would call it something simpler. He would call it the attachment system responding to a perceived threat to proximity. Think of the infant who turns to the door every time it hears a sound, who keeps track, even while playing, of where the caregiver is in the room, who becomes immediately alert when a stranger appears and the caregiver's attention shifts. The adult in a relationship is doing something similar, not because they are immature, not because they are controlling or possessive or unable to trust, because the attachment system is running, monitoring, asking its constant, quiet question, are we okay? Are they still there? Is this still safe? Let your body soften wherever it has been holding. There is nothing you need to defend right now. The panic that arrives when the answer to those questions is uncertain, even briefly, even in situations that rational thought would recognize as trivial, is protest behavior. The system, activated by perceived threat, doing what it was designed to do, signaling urgency. And here is what makes this particularly difficult. In adult relationships, the protest signal often does not look like reaching. It looks like irritability, or sulking, or the tight silence that fills a room. It looks like an argument about something that, on the surface, has nothing to do with attachment. The real message underneath, I am afraid you are moving away from me, is too vulnerable to say directly, and so it comes out sideways, as criticism, as withdrawal, as a test of whether the person will come close. The test, unfortunately, often drives the person further away, which confirms the fear, which intensifies the protest, which drives them further. Recognizing this cycle, not just intellectually, but in the body, in the moment it is happening, is enormously difficult. But it is possible, and the recognition does not require perfection. It does not require that you never feel the panic or never protest. It requires only that at some point in the cycle there is a moment of seeing, a moment of noticing. This is the old thing. This is the alarm, not the emergency. And in that moment of noticing, even slightly, the cycle can soften, not disappear. Not immediately, but soften. There is a woman who knows, intellectually, that her partner is faithful. She has no evidence of anything otherwise. He has given her none. He is, by every observable measure, present, consistent, devoted. And yet, when he laughs at something a colleague says at a dinner party, she feels it, the tightening, the slight removal of herself from the conversation, the careful monitoring for the rest of the evening of how often he laughs at other things. She is not proud of this. She has told herself in 100 quiet moments that it is unreasonable, and it is, rationally speaking. But the nervous system is not doing rational calculations at that moment. It is doing pattern recognition. It is doing what it has always done when the person who matters appears to be angled toward someone else. It is registering. The attention is elsewhere. And it is responding to that registration the way it learned very early to respond, with a tightening, with a monitoring, with a slight but unmistakable quality of internal alarm. Bowlby saw this clearly. The adult jealousy that embarrasses us is the attachment system operating in territory it was not originally designed for, but the system does not know that. The system knows only this person matters, and right now their attention is not here. And from that knowing, all the rest follows, not by choice, not by immaturity, by the ancient logic of a system that was built when mattering and surviving were the same thing. Bowlby observed something in his clinical work that he found both humbling and hopeful. He found that the adults who were most effective at offering repair in their relationships, who could move back toward closeness after conflict, who could acknowledge hurt without collapsing or defending, were often adults who had done their own work. Not necessarily in therapy, though often there. Sometimes simply in the long, honest conversation with oneself that a life, if lived attentively, eventually requires. The reckoning with what happened when you were small. The gradual, imperfect understanding of the patterns that were built then, and the slow choice made not once, but over and over to interrupt those patterns when they arise. The choice to return rather than withdraw, to speak rather than go quiet, to say, "I am sorry," and mean it, to reach toward the person even when everything in the nervous system is saying, "Stay back." It is safer here. This is not easy. It is, in fact, one of the harder things a human being can choose to do. To override the nervous system's old learning, to act against the pattern, to repair when the urge is to protect. But each time it is chosen, it becomes slightly more possible. Each successful repair makes the next one slightly easier. Not because the pattern disappears, but because the nervous system is learning something new. That repair is possible, that reaching across the rupture does not always lead to more pain, that closeness, however carefully it must be approached, is available, and softening over time is how things change. Chapter 20: Anger at the Closed Door. Bowlby was not afraid of anger. This was unusual for a theorist in his tradition. Many of his contemporaries viewed anger as a problem to be solved, a symptom to be understood and dissolved. They saw anger in their patients as resistance, or as displaced aggression, or as the expression of some deeper underlying conflict. Bowlby had a different view. He saw anger as functional. Specifically, he saw the anger that arises in response to separation or loss, what he called the anger of separation, as a healthy signal, a protest. Not protest as in a political demonstration. Protest in the biological sense. The system signaling loudly and urgently that something important has been disrupted and that the disruption needs to be addressed. The anger of a child whose parent has been away for days. The anger of a spouse whose partner has been emotionally absent for months. The anger that comes after grief, when the lost person is still somehow being blamed for leaving. These angers are not irrational. They are the attachment system insisting this mattered. This disruption is not okay. Something needs to change. Notice the weight of your hands. Let them rest. Nothing needs to be resolved in this moment. But Bowlby also recognized that the anger of separation could turn into something else. When the anger is not heard, when the protest is not met with any response that matters, when the door remains closed, regardless of how loudly it is knocked on, the anger can curdle, can become chronic, can harden into something that no longer has a clear object, can become the background music of a life, a low-level hostility, a difficulty trusting, a braced for disappointment quality that makes genuine closeness difficult to receive. Or it can be swallowed, can be turned inward, can become the harsh inner voice that finds fault with everything, especially oneself. The inner critic that echoes the criticism the child received, or the criticism the child could not direct at the parent who was needed too much to be risked. There is a man in his mid-40s who has never been able to explain why he is so quick to anger at small things. The traffic, the misplaced keys, the minor inefficiencies of daily life. His anger is disproportionate, and he knows it. What he does not quite know is that the anger belongs to something older, to the father who never came home for dinner despite the promises, to the mother who was always somehow too tired for the conversation he needed to have, to the small self who needed something and learned that needing loudly was the only thing that had any chance of working, and the anger turned sideways through decades now lands on traffic. Bowlby's insight is this: anger is information. Before it becomes a problem, it is a message. And the message, underneath all the displaced targets and all the years of misdirection, is always the same. I needed more than I got. I needed the door to open, and it did not. Hearing that message, really hearing it, with the same compassion you might offer a child who had been left waiting too long, is not easy. But it is the beginning of something. Bowlby wrote about what he called the anger of separation. He was careful to distinguish it from the anger of threat, the anger that arises when something external endangers us. The anger of separation is different. It is directed at the person we love, at the very person whose absence has made us afraid. And this is the strange, painful logic of the attachment system. The person we love is also the source of our greatest vulnerability. If they did not matter so much, their distance would not alarm us. If their absence did not alarm us, we would not become angry. The anger is proportional to the love. And this is why, in the relationships that matter most to us, the anger can be the most intense and the most confusing. A couple in a long marriage can find themselves in an argument so fierce that an observer might wonder if they even like each other. But that fierceness is often the mirror of the bond. The anger has the pitch and urgency of protest because the stakes are those of attachment. Because the question underneath the fight is never what the fight appears to be about. The question is always this: are you still there? Will you stay? Can I count on you? And the anger, stripped of its content, is a demand for an answer. The beginning of understanding what the anger was always trying to say. Let your jaw soften now. Let the breath find its own rhythm. There is a relief that comes from understanding this, from seeing the anger not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a message to be decoded. The person who can pause in the middle of the old fire and ask, what is the attachment need underneath this, has done something remarkable. They have created a small gap between the feeling and the reaction. And in that gap, something other than the pattern becomes possible. Not easily, not quickly, but possible. And possibility tonight is enough. Chapter 21. Grief without language. There is a grief that has no words, not because the person experiencing it lacks the language, But because the grief arrived before language did, before the brain could form the sentence, "I miss you," before the child could even understand what missing meant, before there was a concept of time, of absence, of person, only the felt sense of a warmth that was there and then was not. This is the earliest grief, the grief of the infant separated from its attachment figure. The grief that Bowlby spent decades studying, not because he was interested in infant suffering in isolation, but because he was convinced that this early, wordless grief was the template for all the grief that follows. The adult grief that arrives at 2 a.m, the grief that does not have a clear object, that attaches itself to small things, a song, a smell, the quality of light at a certain hour, and through those small things reaches back towards something much larger and much older, the grief that feels disproportionate to its apparent cause. Bowlby argued that much of what we call complicated grief in adults, grief that will not resolve, that lingers for years, that shows up sideways as depression or anxiety or a generalized heaviness that the person cannot explain, has its roots in exactly this wordless early template. Not because the adult is re-experiencing infant grief directly, but because the early template shapes how the nervous system processes all subsequent loss. Let the darkness of the room hold you gently. Let the next breath come without effort. There is a woman in her late 50s who lost her brother 3 years ago. She and her brother were never particularly close. They lived in different cities. They spoke occasionally. The relationship was cordial, warm at a low level, not intimate. And yet his death unmade her in ways she cannot explain. She expected grief, but not this kind. Not the kind that feels like falling through the floor. Not the kind that reaches back through her whole life and makes her feel like a child. Suddenly, inexplicably small. What she is feeling is not only the loss of her brother, it is the activation of every loss that came before. The grief of the child who reached and was not held. The grief of the girl who lost her mother to depression before she was old enough to name what was happening. The grief that has been waiting, patient and wordless, for a large enough loss to crack the surface. Her brother's death cracked it. And what came through was not only him. Bowlby called this the reactivation of attachment grief. A new loss reaches back through the body and wakes the old ones, and the grief that arrives is larger than its apparent occasion. This is not pathology. This is the layered nature of grief. Each significant loss opening a door to the ones that preceded it, each loss an occasion for what may be, finally, a reckoning with what was lost long ago. And here is the strange, beautiful, painful truth about this kind of grief. It is not only suffering, it is also, in some obscure way, completion. There is research suggesting that humans are not alone in this layered grief. Primatologist Jane Goodall observed chimpanzees in the wild entering what appeared to be prolonged states of despondency after the death of a close companion. Young chimpanzees separated from their mothers showed behavioral changes that persisted for months. Some never fully recovered their previous ease of engagement. Bowlby read this research with something that was not surprise. It confirmed what he had long suspected. Grief, real, deep. Reorganizing grief is not a cultural construct. It is a biological response to the disruption of attachment. And like attachment itself, it is ancient, far older than language, far older than the rituals and practices that human culture has developed to contain and honor it. And this means that when grief arrives in ways that confuse us, wordless, disproportionate, arriving in places where we did not expect it, we are not experiencing a malfunction. We are experiencing the deep architecture of what it means to be a creature built for bond. The grief that comes without warning in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The grief that sits behind the eyes during a song that should not mean anything. The grief that finds its way up through the floor of a good day, a successful day, a day when everything went right. This grief is not new. It is old. It has been there, patient and wordless, waiting for a moment quiet enough to make itself known. The reaching that never found its object in the early years, finding at last in the act of grieving now a shape it can inhabit, a permission to acknowledge. I needed more than I had, and I am allowed, finally, to know that. There is a reason why so many people find the later years of life unexpectedly emotional, why the 50s and 60s and 70s often bring a reckoning with grief that the busyness of the earlier decades kept at bay. Bowlby would recognize this. He believed that grief that has not been processed does not disappear. It waits. It waits in the body, in the accumulated tension of decades of managing and coping and getting on with it. It waits for the conditions that will allow it to surface. And often, those conditions arrive when the busyness of life finally slows, when the children are grown and the career is established and the noise of daily obligation is slightly less. And in that slight quieting, the grief that has been waiting finds the room it needs. And people who have considered themselves not particularly emotional, not the type to dwell on things, find themselves moved by things they did not expect. A piece of music, the death of someone they were not particularly close to, a photograph, the quality of afternoon light in autumn. These are not random. They are the grief, finally finding language, or not language, finding permission. Permission to surface, to be felt, to be acknowledged. And this grief, however unexpected, however late, is not a crisis. It is completion. It is the reaching, finally, finding something it can land in. Chapter 22. Loss and the searching mind. When a significant attachment figure is lost, the mind begins to search. This is one of Bowlby's most counterintuitive findings, and one of his most compassionate. He found that human beings, and not only human beings, but other social animals as well, respond to loss not with an immediate acceptance that the person is gone, but with a period of searching, not necessarily literally, not necessarily consciously, but the nervous system, oriented toward finding the person who matters, continues to orient, continues to look. The widow who catches herself listening for her husband's key in the door. The adult who reaches for the phone to call a parent who has been dead for 2 years. The person who sees, for a moment, on a crowded street, the face of someone they loved and lost. These are not delusions. They are not signs of mental instability. They are the attachment system doing what it was designed to do, searching for the person who was its reference point, the person around whom the nervous system had organized itself. And when that person is gone, the system keeps searching for a time. Let your breath slow now. Let the weight of your body remind you where you are. And Bowlby spent years studying bereavement. He interviewed widows and widowers. He read accounts of grief across cultures, across centuries, and what he found again and again was the same basic shape. First, the shock, the numbness, the period in which the reality of the loss has not quite reached the body. Then the searching, the yearning, the looking for a person who cannot be found. Then the gradual, painful, deeply non-linear process of reorganizing, of building a life that does not have this person at its center, of finding slowly and imperfectly and over a period of time that cannot be shortened, a new way of being in the world. He was careful to say that this process is not linear. Grief is not a ladder you climb from bottom to top and then you are done. It is more like a tide. It recedes and you think you are further along than you are. And then something small happens. A birthday, a song, a particular quality of afternoon light, and the tide comes back in. And this is not failure. This is the nature of grief. The attachment system reorganizes slowly because the attachment that is being reorganized was built slowly over years in thousands of small interactions, and its dismantling and rebuilding takes time proportional to its depth. The deeper the bond, the longer the process. Not because you are weak, because the bond was real. And a real bond, when it is broken, leaves a real absence. An absence that the searching mind keeps trying to fill, until gradually and without ceremony, it begins to understand that the person is not coming back, that the searching can rest, that the love does not need the searching to keep it alive, that the bond, transformed by loss into something made of memory and meaning rather than presence, can be held in a new way, a way that allows you to carry the person with you without needing them to be where they no longer can be. Chapter 23, Depression After Separation. The line between grief and depression is not always clear. And Bowlby, who spent years thinking about both, believed this was not accidental. He believed that much of what we call depression, particularly the kind that arrives after a significant loss or disappointment, but also the kind that seems to arrive without obvious cause, is a form of attachment disruption, a response to the experience of loss or of threatened loss, or of a chronic early environment in which the secure base was never quite reliable. The depression that follows the end of a long relationship, the depression that arrives in midlife when the life that was built around a particular person or role or structure suddenly no longer holds. The depression that has been present so long that the person has begun to think of it as a personality trait rather than a response. Bowlby was not saying that all depression is attachment grief in disguise. He was saying that the connection between early attachment experience and the later vulnerability to depression is real and important and often overlooked. That the person who learned in childhood that their needs were unlikely to be reliably met, who built a nervous system calibrated to an uncertain world, is more likely, when loss comes in adulthood, to fall into something deeper than ordinary grief, because they are not only grieving the current loss, they are grieving through the current loss the earlier one. The first time the world felt unreliable, the first time the person they needed was not there. Notice the stillness. You are safe here, in this quiet. There is nothing you need to do with any of this tonight. One of the things that makes Bowlby's approach to depression unusual and useful is that it is not about pathology. It is about meaning. Depression, in his view, is not simply a chemical imbalance to be corrected. It is a signal that something important has been lost or threatened or has never been adequately in place. And like all signals, it deserves to be understood before it is simply suppressed. This does not mean that people should not seek treatment for depression, or that the biological dimensions of depression are not real. They are real, they matter. But it means that alongside treatment, the question, what has been lost, is worth asking. What attachment, what secure base, what connection has been disrupted or was never quite there? And what might it look like to begin, slowly, to rebuild, not to replicate what was lost? Loss changes things. What was cannot be exactly restored, but to build something that serves the function of what was lost. A connection, a consistency, a presence that the nervous system can learn to trust, even if that presence at first must be your own, even if the secure base at first must be built from the inside. We will come to that. But, for now, it is enough to know that depression after loss is not weakness. It is the attachment system in a state of searching that has not yet found its footing. In the years after Bowlby published his trilogy on attachment and loss, a body of research emerged that supported what he had suspected. People with insecure attachment histories were more likely to experience depression after loss, not because they were weaker, but because their nervous systems were already running at a kind of deficit, already carrying the background hum of an alarm system that had never quite learned to rest. And when loss came, large or small, dramatic or quiet, the alarm that fired was not simply responding to the current loss, it was responding to all of it, to the accumulated history of uncertainty, to the long record of moments when the signal was sent and went unanswered. One researcher, working with bereaved adults in the years after Bowlby's foundational work, found something that surprised her. She found that the people who seemed most immediately composed after a major loss, the ones who were coping, managing, functioning, were often the people who experienced the most profound grief 6 and 12 months later. The people who were visibly undone in the early weeks often seemed to find their footing more reliably. It was as though the nervous system needed the grieving to do its work, needed the alarm to sound and be acknowledged before it could gradually quiet. And when the alarm was suppressed, held at bay by the necessity of coping, by the learned strategy of not needing, by the years of practice at managing, it found another way out, a more diffuse way, a way that was harder to trace back to the loss that had triggered it. The body keeps the account, even when the mind is very good at not looking at the numbers. And it will find its footing. Not quickly, not without help, but it will. Chapter 24, Emotional Healing Through Bond. Here is the question that Bowlby kept returning to. Not only what goes wrong when early attachment is disrupted, but what actually heals it. Because understanding the wound is not the same as knowing what closes it. And Bowlby was insistent on this distinction. He had seen too many people who understood their early experience with great precision, who could trace every pattern back to its origin, who could describe the attachment failure in theoretical terms, who had insight that any therapist would envy, and who were still, underneath all of it, lonely and frightened and unable to let anyone truly close. Insight, he concluded, was necessary but not sufficient. What was also required was a different kind of experience, not the experience of understanding, the experience of being met, the experience in real time, in a real relationship, of reaching out and having the reach acknowledged, of showing vulnerability and finding that the vulnerability did not drive the person away, of needing something and discovering that the need could be expressed and received. These experiences, repeated over time, are what actually revise the internal working model. Not the thinking about them, not the understanding of them, the living of them. Let the room hold you. Let whatever is beneath you bear your weight completely. Bowlby believed that the therapeutic relationship, the relationship between a person and their therapist, worked precisely because it offered exactly this. Not because the therapist was a substitute parent, not because therapy was simply talking about the past, but because the therapeutic relationship itself, conducted well, provided a form of secure base. A person who was reliably there, who was emotionally available, who could tolerate the full range of the patient's experience, the anger, the grief, the need, the fear, without withdrawing, without punishing, without becoming unavailable. And in the repeated experience of that availability, session after session, month after month, the nervous system began to update its model, began to learn, slowly and with many setbacks, that this was possible, that a person could be there, that need did not have to be hidden, that vulnerability did not guarantee abandonment. But Bowlby also understood that healing through bond was not limited to therapy. It happened in long friendships that had enough depth and consistency, in marriages that could tolerate conflict and return to warmth, in the experience of a child with a good enough parent that began to revise what the first parent had taught. In any relationship in which the fundamental experience of the secure base was offered reliably enough, over time, to reach the layers of the nervous system where the early model was stored. This is why connection is not a luxury, not an add-on to a meaningful life, but one of its primary mechanisms. The nervous system heals in relationship because it was wounded in relationship. There is a particular moment in therapy that John Bowlby wrote about with great care. The moment when a patient says something they have never said aloud before. Not necessarily something dramatic, not a confession or a revelation, something small, a fear, a longing, a truth about how alone they have felt. And the therapist, instead of interpreting it, analyzing it, placing it in theoretical context, simply receives it. Simply says, with their attention and their steadiness, "I hear that. I am here." Bowlby believed that this moment, this small, apparently simple exchange, was doing something in the nervous system that years of insight and understanding could not do alone. It was providing a corrective experience, an experience in which the signal was sent and was met, in which the reaching was answered, in which the model that said showing vulnerability creates distance was gently, quietly proved wrong. He called it the corrective emotional experience. Not because the therapist was pretending to be the parent, not because the therapeutic relationship erased the early one, but because the nervous system, in the right conditions, with the right kind of steady, reliable presence, begins to update its predictions, begins to learn, cautiously and with many setbacks, that this is possible, that a person can be there fully, consistently, without judgment, without fleeing, and what the nervous system learns in therapy, it can begin to apply elsewhere, to the friendship, to the marriage, to the relationship with oneself. Each experience of genuine meeting is a lesson, and lessons accumulate. And because it was designed from the very beginning for exactly this, there is a moment that Bowlby described in his clinical writing that captures something essential. A patient, a woman in her 40s who had spent years managing herself with great efficiency, arrived one day and said something different from her usual careful account of her week. She said, "I am so tired of holding myself together." And Bowlby wrote that he said nothing for a moment. He simply let the sentence be there. And then he said, quietly, "You do not have to hold yourself together right now." She cried for a long time. Not dramatically, with a quality of exhausted relief. The holding together had been so long, so complete, so automatic that she had forgotten she was doing it. And here, in a quiet room, in a relationship that had become safe enough to allow it, the holding loosened. Just for a moment. Just enough. This is what healing through bond looks like. Not the dramatic breakthrough. Not the cathartic revelation. The quiet permission to put something down for a moment, in the presence of a person who will still be there when you pick it back up. And because it was designed from the very beginning for exactly this. Chapter 25, Parents and Unconscious Transmission. One of the most humbling findings to come from attachment research was this. The way a parent was attached in childhood predicts, with remarkable accuracy, how their own child will be attached. Not because people choose to repeat the past, not because parents consciously model the attachment patterns they received, but because the internal working model, built in childhood, operating below awareness, shapes how the parent responds to their own child. The mother who was anxiously attached as a child does not decide to be inconsistently available. She simply finds in her own body the patterns she was given. Sometimes rushing in with too much, sometimes pulling back, sometimes reading danger where there is none, sometimes too tired to notice the reaching at all. The father who learned to be avoidant does not decide to be emotionally distant with his children. He simply finds that closeness requires something of him that he was never shown how to give. This is not blame. This is biology meeting biography. This is the internal working model doing exactly what it is designed to do. Orienting the person toward relationships in the ways that it learned very early that relationships work. Just notice the air in the room, the quiet, the fact that you are still here. Mary Main, the researcher who identified disorganized attachment, also developed a tool called the Adult Attachment Interview. It was designed not to understand how people remembered their childhoods, but how they talked about them. What she found was that it was not the content of the childhood that predicted what kind of parent someone would be. It was the coherence with which they could speak about it. Parents who could tell the story of their childhood clearly, acknowledging the difficult parts honestly, describing the good parts without idealization, making sense of the experience in a way that held it all together, tended to raise securely attached children. Even if their own childhoods had been difficult, even if they had experienced loss or disruption, or caregivers who were not reliable. What mattered was not the childhood itself, it was whether the person had made sense of it, had processed it enough to carry it without being controlled by it, had developed what Maine called earned security, not given in a fortunate childhood, but built through the hard, patient work of making sense of an imperfect one. This finding is one of the most hopeful in all of attachment research, because it means that the transmission of insecure attachment from generation to generation is not inevitable. It can be interrupted by understanding, by therapy, by honest conversation, by the slow, non-linear, imperfect process of making sense of what happened and why, by the willingness to look at the childhood you had, not with blame, not with bitterness, not with the impossible standard of what it should have been, but with honesty and with the compassion that every person at every age deserves. The parents who did what they could with what they had. One of the most moving things Bowlby wrote about was the parent who came to therapy not for themselves, for their child. They came in worried, confused, sometimes defensive. The child was having difficulties. The school had expressed concern. Something was not right, and no one could quite say what. And in the course of the conversation, something unexpected happened. They began to talk about their own childhood, about the things that had never been spoken, the parent who was not quite available, the family that looked fine from the outside and felt uncertain on the inside, the loneliness that had no name because it was not supposed to exist. And as they talked, they began to see it, the connection, not as blame, not as a simple causal arrow from their past to their child's present, but as a thread connecting the child who is struggling now to the child they once were. And in seeing that thread, something changed. The defensiveness softened, because understanding, real understanding, the kind that reaches the feeling underneath the behavior, changes the relationship to what has happened. It does not erase it, but it interrupts the automatic transmission. It creates a small gap between the C's, pattern, and the response. And in that gap, a new possibility appears, a different offering, a slightly different atmosphere. The thread does not have to become a chain. And that understanding offered to a parent in a quiet office, in the middle of an ordinary Thursday, is sometimes the beginning of something that changes what their child will eventually offer their own children, and the children who needed more than was there. Both of those things can be true at once. And holding both of them without collapsing either into the other is one of the greatest gifts you can give to everyone who comes after you. Chapter 26, The Family as Atmosphere. There is a quality to certain homes. You notice it within moments of arriving. Before a word has been spoken, before anything has been offered or explained, it is not the furniture, not the light, not the smell of whatever is on the stove. It is something in the air, a warmth or a tension or an alertness, a sense of what is permitted here and what is not. A felt sense of whether this is a place where you can breathe fully or a place where you need to manage yourself carefully. Children who grow up in these atmospheres absorb them completely, not as opinions or beliefs, as atmosphere, as the quality of the air they learn to breathe. Bowlby understood the family not as a set of rules or roles, but as an emotional environment, a system, a field of relationships in which each person affected and was affected by every other person in ways that were largely invisible and often unconscious. And the emotional temperature of that system, whether it was primarily warm or primarily anxious, primarily open or primarily defended, primarily safe or primarily unpredictable, was the temperature at which the children in it developed. Let your body settle a little more. Let the quiet be completely quiet. Think about the house you grew up in, not the rooms, the feeling of walking through the front door after school, the feeling of dinner time, the feeling of the hour before bed, the quality of the silence when everyone had gone quiet. Most people, when they close their eyes and reach for those feelings, find something complex, not simply bad or simply good, but layered. Warmth in some places, tension in others. Safety in certain rooms and not others. Certain adults who were available in ways that others were not. Children navigate these complexities with remarkable skill. They develop, without knowing they are developing, a very precise map of the family's emotional geography. They know where it is safe to be themselves, where it is not, what brings warmth and what brings distance, which feelings are welcome and which must be managed privately. And these maps, laid down in the years before they had words for what they were doing, travel with them everywhere they go. This is not a counsel of despair. The family atmosphere you grew up in shaped you. It does not define you, but it does help to look at it honestly, not to blame the people who created it. Most of them were doing the best they could with the resources they had, but to understand it, to see the blueprint that was given to you, and to begin, consciously and with whatever support you can find, to draw a different one. Because the atmosphere you create in your home, in your relationships, in the presence you bring to the people who depend on you, is something you have more choice over than you may think. You do not have to pass on every draft. Here is a small thing that reveals a great deal. Watch how a family handles the moment when someone in it is upset. Not the large crises, the ordinary ones. The child who comes home from school having had a difficult day. The spouse who arrives home carrying something difficult that has not yet found words. What happens in that first moment? Is the upset noticed? Is it named? Is it met with curiosity or with the implicit message that upset is inconvenient, or with the demand that it resolve itself quickly? Or is there room for it? A small pocket of availability. A person who says, with their presence, if not always with their words, I see that something happened. You do not have to be fine right now. These small moments, invisible, unremarkable, occurring dozens of times each week, are the actual substance of the family atmosphere. They determine whether the people in the family learn that difficult feelings can be shared, can be witnessed, can be held by someone else without breaking anything, or whether they learn that difficult feelings must be managed privately, must be presented to the world in a smaller, quieter, more acceptable form. The child who grows up in a family where emotions are welcome learns something essential: that the inner life is not a problem, that needing is not a burden, that being imperfect and struggling and uncertain does not mean being alone in it, and that learning, wordless, accumulated, lived in the body, is one of the greatest gifts that any family can offer. You can begin in small ways to change the weather, and the change begins earlier than you think. It begins in the quality of attention you bring to an ordinary Tuesday evening, in the moment when you put the phone down and look at the person across from you, in the question you ask that is not practical, not about schedules or logistics, but about what they are actually carrying today, in the willingness, when you are the one who is struggling, to say so, not dramatically, not with a demand for anything in particular, just, today has been heavy. I am glad you are here. These small choices, made imperfectly, inconsistently, with all the difficulty that real human beings bring to them, accumulate. They become the atmosphere. They become what the people around you breathe. And the people who breathe a warmer air will build a slightly warmer internal world. And they will pass something different to whoever comes after them. This is how change moves through generations, not through grand intentions, through ordinary moments. This is not a small thing, even though I said it that way. Even though I said it that way. Changing the atmosphere that others breathe around you, becoming slightly more available, slightly more willing to name what is difficult, slightly more able to receive what is offered without deflecting it, ripples outward in ways that are impossible to fully trace. The child who grows up in a slightly warmer atmosphere than you did will grow up with a slightly more solid internal model. They will venture out with slightly less vigilance. They will trust slightly more readily. They will return from the territory of vulnerability slightly less scarred. And there, children will benefit from whatever they build. The attachment patterns that were handed to you were not chosen, but you, to a greater degree than the child you once were, have some choice about what you pass on. Not a perfect choice. Not an unconstrained one, but a choice. A small, daily, imperfect, real choice. To attend, to respond, to show up with whatever presence you have available, to change the weather one quiet day at a time. Chapter 27, How Safety Becomes Freedom. There is a paradox at the heart of Bowlby's work, and it is a beautiful one. The more reliably safe a person feels in their attachment relationships, the more freely they can move in the world. Not freedom from connection. Not freedom despite connection. Freedom through connection. The securely attached child who wanders confidently around the playroom does so because the caregiver is there. The confidence is not independence from the attachment. It is the fruit of it. The adult who takes professional risks, who speaks honestly in difficult conversations, who ventures into unfamiliar emotional territory, this person's capacity to do these things is almost always grounded in a sense, however faint, that they are not entirely alone. That somewhere, someone knows where they are. And this is not weakness. It is the design. The nervous system was never intended to operate in isolation. It was designed to function as part of a web of connections, to be regulated in part by the presence of others who are safe, to use the attunement of close relationships as a kind of external stabilizer for the internal emotional system. This is why isolation is so reliably damaging to mental health. Not because lonely people are fragile, but because the system was designed for company, was designed to use the co-regulation of close relationships, the feedback loop of one nervous system influencing another, to maintain its balance. Let your breath be slow and easy. Let the night be long and quiet. The research on what actually predicts well-being across a human life has reached, again and again, the same conclusion. Not wealth, not achievement, not the absence of adversity, the quality of close relationships, the sense of being known and accepted by at least one other person, the experience, however imperfect, of a secure base. This is not a sentimental finding. It is a biological one. The Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest-running studies of human life ever conducted, followed its participants across more than 80 years. And what it found was clear. The people who were most likely to age well, to remain mentally sharp, physically healthy, and genuinely happy into old age, were the people who had built and maintained warm, close relationships. Not the people who were most successful. not the people who worked the hardest, not the people who accumulated the most, the people who were most connected. This does not mean that anyone who has not had a perfectly secure attachment history is condemned. It means that the work of building secure connections at any age, in any circumstances, even imperfectly and gradually, is among the most important work a human being can do, not as a path to some external achievement, as the direct source of the well-being and freedom that every person deserves. The safety is the freedom, the connection is the courage, the secure base, however late it comes, however imperfectly it is built, makes everything else possible. There is a research finding that Bowlby would have loved. It comes from developmental psychology, from the study of what happens to securely attached children over time. Researchers found that children who had been classified as securely attached in the strange situation at age 1 showed years later, at age 10, at 15, at 20, a remarkable cluster of qualities. They were more curious, more willing to engage with difficult material, more able to sit with not knowing, more flexible in their thinking, more willing to change their minds when presented with evidence. They were not more fearless, they were more able to tolerate the discomfort that comes with genuine learning. And this is the connection that Bowlby always emphasized. The secure base does not produce children who have no fear. It produces children who have the internal resources to act in the presence of fear, to continue exploring even when the territory is unfamiliar, to trust that if they venture too far and need to come back, the base will still be there. This capacity, this willingness to keep moving in the face of uncertainty, is not a small thing. It is the foundation of everything we call growth. Every new skill learned, every difficult conversation entered, every relationship risked, every act of creativity or courage or genuine vulnerability, all of it rooted in the same ground. The felt sense, however faint, that the world is navigable, that help exists, that you are not entirely alone, and it is never too late to begin building it. There is a line from Bowlby's later writing that captures something worth carrying into sleep. He wrote, not in these exact words, but in this spirit, that the capacity for connection is one of the most enduring features of human life, that it persists through loss, through disappointment, through the long middle years when everything feels like management rather than living, that even in old age, even in isolation, even after the greatest losses, the attachment system is still reaching, still hoping, still in its ancient and faithful way, looking for the face that means safe. And the fact that it is still reaching is not a burden, it is evidence of life, of a particular kind of courage that is so ordinary, so constant, so quietly heroic that we rarely think to name it. The courage of still caring, the courage of still hoping, the courage of being, despite everything, still here. And it is never too late to begin building it. Chapter 28. Repairing the broken bonds break. In small ways, they break constantly. In the small ruptures of daily life, a misunderstanding, a moment of unavailability, a conversation that did not go well. In the larger ruptures of betrayal, abandonment, significant loss, the breaking is not the end of the story. What Bowlby found, and what the research that followed him confirmed, is that the repair of ruptures matters as much as, perhaps more than, the absence of ruptures. The caregiver, who is always available, but who, when the inevitable misattunement happens, makes a quick and genuine repair, this caregiver produces a securely attached child. The caregiver who is generally available, but who, when things go wrong, becomes defensive or withdraws or does not acknowledge what happened, this caregiver, despite their general availability, produces something more uncertain. It is the repair that teaches, the repair that says we can get it wrong and come back. We can hurt each other and still find our way back to warmth. We can break and be mended. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands be still. Think about the relationships in your life that have felt most sustaining. Not the relationships that were easiest or most harmonious or most free of conflict. The ones that felt most solid, most likely. Those relationships were not the ones with the fewest ruptures. They were the ones with the most consistent repairs. The friend who knew how to say, "I was wrong," and meant it. The partner who, after a difficult argument, found their way back to gentleness. The parent, perhaps much later in life, perhaps imperfectly, who found a way to acknowledge what they had missed and to offer something different. These repairs, these small and large moments of refinding each other across a rupture, are the building material of secure attachment in adult relationships. They are not dramatic. They do not require grand gestures. They require something more difficult. The willingness to return, to cross the prophet, distance created by conflict or misunderstanding or hurt, and to make contact again. To say, with words or with presence or with the simple act of still being there, "I have not gone anywhere. This is still us. We can still do this." And for many people, this willingness to return is the thing they most need to practice, not the grand opening moves of relationship, not the falling in love, the declaration, the promise, but the quiet, unremarkable, and daily return. The turn toward each other after the turn away, the repair. And each repair, however small, however imperfect, is a lesson that the nervous system receives and stores. A small revision to the model, a tentative expansion of what is understood to be possible. We can break and we can be mended. That is the most important thing that any relationship can teach. Chapter 29. A secure base within. We have spent this night tracing a thread that begins in the earliest days of a life, in the wordless exchange between a small body and the person who holds it. And that extends, unbroken and invisible, through every relationship that follows, through every moment of reaching and being met, or reaching and not being met, through every version of the question that the attachment system never stops asking: are you there? Can I trust this? Is this safe? We have looked at what happens when the answer to those questions in the early years was uncertain. What it does to the nervous system, what it does to the internal model of self and other, what it does to the way a person loves and fears and grieves and protects themselves in the decades that follow. And now, here in the later hours of this night, we turn toward a different question. Not what happened, but what is possible. Let your body be completely heavy now. Let the night hold all of it. You do not have to do anything but breathe. Bowlby always believed that the internal working model, for all its power and persistence, was not fixed. He called it a working model precisely because it was designed to work, to be updated, to be revised in the light of new information and new experience, and the most profound and lasting revisions, he found, happen when we are able to provide ourselves, either alone or with the help of another person, with something that functions as a secure base, a place of sufficient safety to allow genuine reflection, a quality of attention turned toward our own inner life that is honest and warm and without judgment, a willingness to be curious about our own experience rather than afraid of it. This is not a quick fix. It is not a technique you can learn in an afternoon and then have solved. It is a practice of turning toward the self with the same quality of attention that a good caregiver offers a child. Not with criticism, not with the voice that lists what was wrong today and what must be better tomorrow, with the voice that says, I see you, I know this is hard, you are doing the best you can. And that voice, quiet as it is, easy to dismiss, is the beginning of the secure base within. Mary Main called it earned security, the security that was not given in a fortunate childhood, the security that was built slowly and imperfectly through the work of making sense of the past, of finding language for what happened, of carrying the story of one's own life in a way that is coherent and honest and compassionate. The work is not completed in one night, It is not completed in 1 year, but it begins and it continues. And each small moment of honest, compassionate self-attention is a brick laid in the foundation. Each moment of choosing curiosity over shame, each moment of meeting your own need with the same care you would offer a child who was frightened. Each moment of pausing before the old alarm fires and asking, is this old or is this now? These are not grand moments, but they are the moments from which everything else is built. And the secure base, once built even partially, even tentatively, even imperfectly, becomes itself a foundation from which you can venture out, from which you can risk, from which you can love, from which you can, when the darkness comes, find your way back to the light. Chapter 30. Resting after attachment pain. Let us pause here, not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to arrive. Right now, wherever you are, you have spent a long time with ideas that matter, with the ideas of a man who spent his life trying to understand the most fundamental need of the human heart, the need to be close, to be held, to know that someone knows where you are. Before we offer the practice that closes this night, let us simply acknowledge that you have been listening, that in the act of listening, of staying with these ideas through the long hours, you have been doing something that matters. You have been paying attention to your own inner life. And that attention offered to yourself, by yourself, in the quiet of this night, is itself a small version of the secure base, a presence that stayed, a witness that did not leave. Just for a moment, let that be enough. Let your body sink into whatever is holding it. Just to notice where we have arrived. We began tonight with a feeling, a familiar ache, the one that arrives when the room is quiet and the mind looks for something it cannot quite find. We gave that ache a name, a history, a context. We followed it back through Bowlby's life and his questions, back through the foundational discoveries about how human beings attach, about what attachment makes possible and what its absence costs. We watched the infant reach and the child protest, and the adult love under the shadow of what was learned before love had words. We sat with the grief and the anger and the fear of abandonment. We looked honestly at the internal working model, that invisible blueprint that the nervous system carries everywhere. And then we turned toward something different, toward what heals, what repairs, what slowly, imperfectly allows the model to be revised. And here, at the end of this long journey, I want to offer you something simple. Let your body sink into whatever is holding it. Floor, bed, cushion, chair. Let it be completely supported. You do not have to hold yourself up right now. The ache that brought you here tonight, that familiar pressure behind the chest, That longing that arrives in the quiet is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that you are human, that the attachment system, which was built into you long before you had any say in the matter, is working, is still reaching, is still hoping. And the hope in it, that stubborn, patient, ancient hope, is not a wound. It is a capacity for closeness, for love, for the particular courage that only people who have been hurt and kept hoping anyway are able to offer. You carry the marks of imperfect attachment. Most people do. You carry the patterns that were built before you could choose. The nervous system's learned response to a world that was not always as safe as it needed to be. And you also carry the capacity to understand those patterns, to see them for what they are, old solutions to old problems, to hold them with the compassion they deserved then and still deserve now, and to begin, wherever you are, to build something different. One small experience of safety at a time, one moment of honest self-compassion, one repair after one rupture, one turn toward connection when the old instinct says to withdraw, one honest word when silence would have been easier. The secure base is built in exactly this way, not in grand gestures, not in single transforming moments, but in the accumulated weight of small, consistent choices to stay, to reach, to trust a little, to be trusted a little. Tonight, you have sat with one of the most important questions a human being can ask. Not, what is wrong with me, but where did this come from and what can I do with it? And Bowlby's answer, offered across decades of careful and compassionate research, is this: what you carry is not a flaw, it is a history. And histories, unlike destinies, can be added to, can be understood and reframed and slowly transformed. The work is not finished tonight. It never is, for any of us. But you have done something tonight that matters. You have listened to the thread. You have followed it back through the years, through the early patterns, through the wordless learning of the body, and you have arrived here, quieter, perhaps, than when you began, a little less alone in the understanding of your own ache, a little more compassionate toward the child who learned what they learned, and a little more capable of offering something different to yourself, to the people in your life, to the next version of this story. Now, let your breathing become very slow. Let your eyes stay closed if they have closed. Let the ideas that have come tonight find their place somewhere beneath conscious thought, not to be solved or organized or decided about, just to rest there, in the way that seeds rest in winter soil, still, quiet, not finished, but not done either. Let the darkness be soft. Let the body be heavy. Let the mind, if it wanders, wander without resistance. You have done enough for tonight. The attachment, the longing, the hope, all of it can rest now. You can rest now. And tomorrow, and in the days that follow, Bowlby's quiet, persistent, deeply human idea will be there when you need it. The reminder that every person is designed for closeness, that the ache for it is not a weakness, that the reaching, even when it does not find what it sought, is not futile. It is the most human thing there is. And you, reaching for something real in the quiet of this night, are exactly where you are supposed to be. Sleep now.